Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Centre for the start of Halloween week at the Humanities Centre. We have a packed program of scary and frightening things going on. So we have, if any of you want to come back and see lots of other things, silent movie screenings from the 1920s and 30s, which I know is top of your list of things to do this week. All that's running through Thursday. Friday we have talks, Tuesday and Thursday, all about the Halloween season. At the very centre of our Halloween programming stands this marvellous exhibition, Spectral Presences, envisioned and curated by Derek Cartwright, Associate Professor, yes, indeed, Associate Professor in the Department of Art, Architecture and Art History. We are truly blessed in the Humanities Centre to have our gallery overseen by such a gifted and experienced man. Dr. Cartwright is Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Timken Museum in Balboa Park, and since the opening of the Humanities Centre way back in 2016, he has curated the multifarious shows staged in the gallery, always to tremendous effect. I think this one, I think Maggie was saying, in terms of foot traffic and excitement, this may be up there with the most popular of the shows. So, speaking with us this evening about Shallow Fakes, Notes on Spectral Presences, please welcome Dr. Derek Cartwright.
Such a sweet introduction. Thanks. It's a small show, and it won't take us very long to go through it. So I thought before we do that, I would give you a little background in case you don't know anything already about spirit photography. Just quickly, out of a show of hands, who has seen spirit photographs before? Oh, good. Okay, I wasn't sure when we planned this whether there would be that kind of recognition, but just to share with you what I thought we would do in 15 minutes or so is I'd like to give you a short history of photographic technologies and a little bit of how they might relate to these photographs that we're going to look at. We'll do a tour and then answer any questions you have. Does that sound good? Okay. In 1839, in France and in England, almost simultaneously, patents were issued for photographic processes. And they differed in significant ways. In England, they were working with paper negatives, in fact, that could be reproduced and made multiple images of. And in France, this guy, Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre, came up with a process where on a shiny metal plate that had been perfumed with mercury and a few other toxic chemicals, you could record and permanently fix an image. And so he patents this process in France, and within months, really, it spreads throughout the world. So if you were a 49er in San Francisco, you could have your daguerreotype taken with no problem. So it was a mass change in the way portraiture and representation took place. It had some drawbacks, and I just wanted to, in case you didn't know about daguerreotyping, it would really involve you holding still, like Nicole. You would have to sit back there frozen for like 2 or 3 minutes without moving to avoid a kind of blurry impression, like this baby, right? The baby moves, and therefore we don't see the face clearly. It was not uncommon, in fact, it was quite common for people to be screwed into place in order to have their daguerreotype portraits made, because that would ensure that you didn't wobble or move. And so this caricature by Daumier shows us, reads, this new process employed to obtain the most gracious poses, right? How could you have a gracious pose if your ears are being drilled with screws and held into place? I guess that's Daumier's joke, but I think it's funny too. But what happens right away is there's this sense that photography has some unintended effects, and this is one of them, this blurred image, which, of course, this looks like a baby less than a year old. It would be hard to make that child sit still for that long. And so, of course, the mother, who's really good at sitting and staring, doesn't have that problem, and this image comes down to us as a kind of funny hybrid, I would say. The one thing photography is really good for in this period is taking photographs of dead people. So there's a whole genre of photography in the 1840s, which is photographs of corpses, which for many of us may seem like an unusual thing. I don't know, I'm looking at you, Jillian, because you think about this stuff, but the idea of keeping with you for all time a photographic record of your just deceased relative is not something that we as a common culture share very much of, I don't think. But in this time, you think about it, it was a way to remember someone and to keep them with it. So lots and lots of daguerreotypes of dead people. And oftentimes these would be passed down within a family, so you would know what your ancestors look like. I'm always sort of haunted by these images today when I see them in, thrift stores and things like that, because they sort of feel like orphaned dead and need to be brought back into some kind of safe enclosure. But this propensity of photography to capture living and dead likenesses is something that motivated the French theorist Roland Barthes to write what I think is, Brian and I teach a class together, and he's fond of saying, if you want to be an educated person, you should read this book. If you want to be an educated person, you should read this book by Roland Barthes, which in its English translation is called Camera Lucida. But Barthes has this sense that a photograph is always a record of death. He says, this is a picture. When I take a picture of you, Maria, it's a representation of you alive, but at some point in that knowledge, you will be dead someday. I'm sorry to pick on you in this way, but that is just part of the nature of the photograph, that it is always a representation of the dead and going to die. And so he is alert to this sensibility that photography in a world where religion doesn't occupy the same roles, maybe obtains a kind of quasi-religious function within our social lives, that we keep these images close as a way to resurrect them for us in a lasting way. So after daguerreotypy, and this is going to go really quickly, I promise you, there are just all these new technologies that get introduced, rapid fire, refinements, as we know from our own technological world. There's always somebody trying to best the last thing. And so in 1849, you have the invention of lenticular stereo viewers by a guy named David Brewster and others who came up with this methodology where you could take a photograph, insert it into a viewer, and we have one in the gallery, and get a stereoscopic view of it. What's interesting about that is this interest in photographing ghosts sort of coincides with the development of this new technology. And I'm curious about that, why photographers all of a sudden wanted to make more material, more 3D, more realistic, these semi-transparent ghosts. And David Brewster himself provided a recipe for anybody who wanted to reproduce this. He said, if you want to make a photograph of a ghost, this is how you'll do it. You'll sort of set up a scene, photograph people who are holding their positions, and you'll allow someone to walk into that scene briefly and then disappear. And because of the long exposure time, you'd have this sort of ghostly image. And so he gave away the game in describing how everybody could make their own ghostly stereo views. That invention is superseded by the carte de visite, which was a small photograph that you could put into your handbag or your wallet or something like that, like a visiting card. And these were produced very cheaply in France by a guy named Dissatisfying, who invented the process. But again, this method of circulating images of dead people became commonplace as a result. I think for $5, you could get a sheet of 12 carte de visites that would be cut to your order, and then you could share them with your family. So it meant that photography was now in its mass-produced moment. With that, we get the arrival of these fully blown spirit photographs, which become the specialty of some photographers at this time. So I'm just showing you 3 by the French photographer Alfred Villeneuve, and there's also in the United States, we'll talk about him in a minute, Mumler, And these artists are known for their ability to produce photographs of ghosts. In fact, Mumler starts in Boston, gets a bad reputation for making these ghost images, and then moves to New York, where he gets an even worse reputation for making them. But we'll talk about that in a moment. In 1869, Mumler, and this is one of his photographs done in this carte de visite format, is brought on trial in New York City and accused of fraud in making these spirit images. He's acquitted, but the coverage of that trial, it's bigger than anything we've had in our lifetimes. Every day, in fact, I have an issue of the New York Times. It was covered front page news in the New York Times every day, what was happening on this trial. And you could say, why? I mean, why would the manufacturer of these quasi-scientific photographs of ghostly presence, why did it upset people so much? And there were a lot of reasons, which maybe we can talk about in the exhibition, but everybody came out either to support Mumler and to say, yes, he was photographing ghosts and he had supporters, or people like P.T. Barnum. Do you guys know who Barnum is? Sort of greatest show on earth. He made his career sort of celebrating fakery and then decided at the end of his career to debunk it. He called it humbug, and he actually testifies against Mumler, saying these are fakes. And I'll show you in a minute how strongly he felt about making clear that Mumler was a fraud. As I said, Mumler was not convicted of that crime, and it seems hard to think of it as a crime at that time, but he was accused of, by some people, sort of destroying the peace of the spirits, right? Who is this guy to make the spirits angry by pretending to photograph them? By the late 19th century, you have tintypes and cabinet cards, large-scale photographs, which really become wonderful formats for distributing information about spirits, and I'm showing you just two examples of that. But I think one way to understand the popularity of these images is to think of it in the historical context of the Civil War. So the Civil War was the first, at least in the United States, conflict to be fully documented with photography. And so images like The Harvest of Death by Timothy O'Sullivan were part of a popular consciousness, and people really were uncomfortable with these images. I think they still have the power to seem uncomfortable to us today, but seeing so many dead sort of in a field that seemed to stretch to the horizon with body after body really made people feel unnerved by photography's representation of death. And in some ways, the spirit photograph is a consoling image in response to these much more difficult images. When Walt Whitman sees these photographs, he says, the real war will never get into books, but this is the real war. Seeing the last home of a rebel sharpshooter at Gettysburg, that image was a kind of haunting that needed to be replied to in some form by a more consoling image. And I think the spirit photograph really comes into popularity in the post-Civil War years, partly as a response to that. Of course, in 1888, we have the flexible film that Kodak, George Eastman invents, and so you could send a camera to Rochester and it would come back with all your photographs fully printed for you. And with that, anybody could produce a spirit photograph, right? Adele could be making a mini career at the back of this room, producing spirit photographs, according to what were really well-known strategies of this time. But with that, too, you had just pure accidents. Things, when Maria sends the camera back to Rochester and it comes back with something like that, it's actually a little bit hard to explain. Maybe she can recall the circumstances under which this image was produced, but the accident itself had this uncanny quality of these figures that seem to be transparent and floating in space, or things that simply cannot be understood, as in this flare is what it's often called in Polaroid photography, when you get this flash of light. And how to explain that? One explanation could be the spirit world sort of making its presence felt in these vernacular images of the late 19th, early 20th, actually throughout the 20th century. photographers are wise to this, and they sort of begin making, staging, and recording images of ghosts. Seances become a really popular subject for photographers, like this one by John Beattie, and they're often wonderfully inscribed with the actual circumstances under which these spirit photographs were produced. You have also the recording of what's called ectoplasm, which are these spirit forces that just emanate from bodies and are shown in photographs like these. And in fact, I think, Brian, you may be able to correct me, but I think that is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was one of the great arbiters of the reality of spirit photographs in this time. And so photographers do capture this range of images, some of which go under the name of ectoplasmic phenomena, or this other related photographic practice where you just leave a photographic plate out in public and spirit world would write on it, sometimes write people's names, called scotographs by some. So these start to appear in great numbers throughout the early 1900s into the 1920s. I'm showing you here just two more of these ectoplasmic photographs where stuff running out of the nose or body orifices of people. This is the American artist Mike Kelly, who's got these strands of ectoplasm running out of his nostrils and mouth and ears. And I think this was part of that Uncanny project which Kelly did and really brought back in the late 20th century some of these ideas to public consciousness. In the 1950s, you have Kirlian or aura photography. And so we all know that if you use certain multispectral images, you can catch an aura around somebody. And that became closely attached to this spirit photography phenomenon. And then I just want to, as a way to make the bridge into the gallery itself, talk about how many contemporary artists have been interested in this phenomena. I showed you a photograph by Francesca Woodman at the beginning, but people like Ralph Meatyard or Dwayne Michaels have continued to tread in this territory of the spirit photograph in, I think, a really beautiful and successful way. And this is a work by the British-German photographer Adam Fluss. But to sort of bring it closer to some of you students in here, I would just say that if you go high on the television channels on your cable streaming device, you're going to come up against shows that are capturing the paranormal, right? They're there and they're watchable and, I guess, entertaining for many people. If you scroll Instagram long enough, you'll be invited to participate in a tintype photograph session in which you could be shown with dead loved ones. But in fact, these are a kind of precursor to the deep fakes of our own time, right? These are, and that's where the title to this short talk is. There's kind of shallow fake. That people who look at the sort of fake staging of AOC in some, I think she was said to be giving a speech about Sydney Sweeney's jeans, which she never, of course, did, but it was all a kind of photographic manufacture. It's not that different than what P.T. Barnum did when he, to prove Mumler wrong, had himself photographed with Abraham Lincoln's spirit looming over his shoulder. These are efforts to sort of question what is the truth value of the photograph, and I think important ones for us to consider. You'll see in the exhibition, the contemporary artists who are involved in this practice, I think, are doing some of the most beautiful work today, but they're also, in a way, critiquing this phenomenon. So if you want to, you can send this around and be one of 17.2 million people who are doing ghost photographs this week, which is an appealing invitation. But I think what I'll invite you to do instead is step inside the gallery with me and we'll look at the work. There's a huge, voluminous literature dedicated to spirit photographs. I'm not an expert on them. I've tried to educate myself as quickly as possible in order to do this show for Brian, but I think that there's really great work, and for those of you who are interested in this, I want to point you towards some of these sources, which are amazing, and run the gamut from true believers to true skeptics. So we're going to step inside and look at this show. I think it's a small space, as I said. If you're more comfortable waiting, and then I'll take a second group through, that's fine too. But let's go take a look.